Okay, good morning, everyone. You still have that echo? I think we're good. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We got a lot to cover. This is the latest in our continuing education series, TDD or TTY, whatever you want to call it, in the Emergency Communication Center. My name is Lee Santel. I'm with the Communications Division of the Rockland County Sheriff's Office here in downstate New York. We're just north of New York City. We almost touch New York City. Rockland County is actually the smallest county in New York State, except for the 5 boroughs of New York City. But we're pretty well populated. We have a population of about 330,000 at last count. Here at the Sheriff's Office, our semi-consolidated countywide PSAP is answering about 216,000 calls per year. Of that, 124,000 or so is 911, and the other roughly 92,000 is seven-digit administrative phone calls. There's my contact information up there on the screen. As I always say at all these webinars, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, anything else you want to talk about, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. I like hearing from the folks out there in New York State and beyond, and we always have a productive conversation. And also, if you're not following us on Facebook, we always post all of our training. We do quite a bit of training. Right now, not that much in-person training, although we're hoping to open that up very soon, depending on how things go. But certainly our online training and our in-person training are always posted to Facebook first before I even email them out or send them out on the in any other way. So if you're not following us on Facebook, head us over and click us on Facebook, and hopefully you can join us for some more stuff in the future. Quick side note for the record, this webinar is informational only. Although I know 1 or 2 things about 911, I am not the subject matter expert to beat all others, so you should always follow your local agency's policies, procedures, regulations, edicts, things like that. The same goes for APCO. Obviously, I am involved with APCO. I'm on a number of chapter committees, and I'm on some national committees, but and this presentation is presented in conjunction with APCO International, but I don't represent APCO International. So if you have questions about APCO standards or anything else regarding national policy or things like that, I would recommend that you reach out to APCO International. The fine folks in Daytona Beach would be glad to discuss with you everything that you need to know. Speaking of APCO, you probably found out about this webinar through the Atlantic chapter thread on PS Connect. So many of you might be APCO members already, but just in case you're not, I hope you'll consider after the webinar is over becoming a member of APCO International. Remember, when you become a member of APCO International, you automatically become a member of the local chapter where you work or where you live, depending on how you apply. And if you're in one of the 8 states that makes up the Atlantic chapter, then that will be your chapter. It's not expensive at all to join. It's only $7 or $8 a month for most members of APCO, most non-commercial members. You get so many benefits: training, networking, advocacy, conferences, social opportunities, job opportunities, volunteer opportunities, so many things, so many ways to get involved. It's really quick and easy. You just go on the website there and you put in a credit card and you get enrolled. So it's not expensive and it doesn't take long to join. Think about it. If you're not an APCO member, after the webinar is over, head over to apcointl.org/join and join up today. And that's the end of the commercial. So let's jump into the subject material. We're going to talk about what TTY is and how it's used to communicate. I mean, that's not really specific to the 911 center so much, but either way, we'll talk about what TTY is and what they use it for. We'll also talk about if you are in the 911 center, if you are in the ECC and you're getting a call that's a TTY call, how are you going to know that you're getting a TTY call and what do you do? We'll talk about once you've established it, once it's you realize it's a TTY call, how do you converse with the person on the other end of the line when the TTY call is in progress. And we'll talk a little bit about handling TTY calls for service, although in terms of dispatching and things, although obviously that's going to depend highly on your local center's procedures, but we'll gloss over that a little bit. Then we'll talk about telephone relay services and video relay services, which are, I would say, kind of starting to eclipse the whole TTY thing a little bit. We'll talk about those. And then right at the end, we'll switch gears for a moment to talk about what the agency might want to do as opposed to just the telecommunicator in terms of getting ready for receiving TTY calls and make sure everybody's ready to get them when they come in. Okay, so what is a TTY? What is that all about? The TTY stands for teletypewriter. Now, a teletypewriter is very simply a device that's designed to send and receive text over a regular voice phone line. This is a technology that was used by international companies and news organizations long before it became adapted for the home environment or for the consumer environment. You know, like the Associated Press or Reuters, or Telex, they would use these teletypewriter machines to send stuff across the globe before the era of the internet. The teletypewriter, the TTY devices that are used by individuals aren't exactly the same technology as the ones used by the big businesses, but it's pretty similar. It's pretty similar. So basically, it's just a device that you hook up to your phone line, and it lets you send and receive, text messages, basically, or text over a regular phone line, and it was adopted for use by consumers, by hearing impaired or speech impaired people, so that they could communicate with others over a regular voice phone line. And by the way, when you hear the term TDD, which stands for Telecommunications Device for the Deaf, TDD and TTY are exactly the same thing. It's just two terms for the exact same thing. I can't speak personally, not being a member of the hearing impaired community, but I'm given to understand that the hearing impaired community prefers the term TTY over TDD, so that's the term I'll use, but they are the same thing. They are the same thing. Is TTY still a thing in the age of the internet and cell phones? Maybe not as much as it used to be, but certainly there's a large number of people who are still using TTY for their daily communication, and that's going to include contacting the 911 center to to request help or ask for information. So we need to be ready, both from a legal standpoint and also from a best practices standpoint. We need to be ready that we're ready to get these calls when they come in. How do you know if you're getting a TTY call? The phone rings at your console, and you answer the phone. How do you know it's a TTY call? Well, it varies depending on your CPE, depending on your phone console, and it also depends on what kind of TTY device the person calling is using. I'm given to understand that there are some TTY devices out there where there's a voice recording that comes on the line and says, warning, this is a TTY call. I personally have not taken any of these calls with a recorded announcement, but I'm given to understand that they're out there. So obviously, if you hear the message come on the line saying, warning, this is a TTY call, then don't hang up. You need to turn on your TTY capabilities and start receiving the information. You might just hear the TTY tones coming over. So TTY devices work by sending audible tones, audio tones, over the phone line, and they're decoded at the other end and turned into text, and vice versa. When you type back, you send tones over, and they're decoded on the other end. So when you pick up the phone, depending on how your CPE is programmed, when you pick up the phone, you might hear those. It kind of sounds like a modem or a fax machine a little bit. You might hear those bleeps and those bloops coming over the phone line, and then if you know what those sound like, and we'll talk about how to practice later on so that you know what they sound like, but if you know what those sound like, then you'll know, oh, that's a TTY call. We got to turn on the TTY screen and see what's going on with that. I think the most common scenario by far, at least in my experience, is that you just get silence on the line. I'm not talking about like open air where you can hear people talking in the background. I'm talking about dead-keyed silence on the line where you don't hear anything. I found that a lot of the 911 consoles, they mute the audio so that you don't have to listen to the bleeps and the bloops in your ear all day long. That's convenient for when you don't want to make your ears bleed while you're having a TTY conversation. But on the other hand, it means that when you answer the phone, all you hear is dead silence. And that's sort of a problem or a challenge for 911 operators. Sometimes we get, for telecommunicators, sometimes we get silent open line calls with no voice or other background noise that can be heard. It's just a dead open line. We can't, according to national standards, we can't just hang up on that line. We can't just say, oh, it's a 911 hang up or something, an abandoned call, and we're just going to hang it up, and maybe your procedure says to call it back or whatever. We can't just do that. According to standards, we have to activate our TTY equipment to see if the person is actually trying to send a TTY message before we write off that call and move on to other duties. And that's something that I think a lot of telecommunicators have challenges with, where they want to move on to other calls, or they're busy and they want to do other duties, but you've got to query it. If you really can't hear anything, no background noise, no nothing, there's a possibility that it's a muted TTY signal that's coming over, and you're going to want to query that and try to send a TTY message before you write off the call and move on to your other jobs. So that is all about receiving TTY calls at the center. Before we talk about having a conversation over TTY, let's take one quick step back and talk about how people who are hearing or speech impaired communicate when they're in person, when they're face-to-face. Typically, people who are hearing or speech impaired when they're face-to-face, they use sign language. And just like spoken languages or written languages, there's different sign languages in different countries. People from one country who use sign language are not necessarily going to be able to converse with people from another country who use a different foreign language, as it were. And in America, of course, most people are using American Sign Language, sometimes called ASL or Measlan. And ASL is a complex conceptual language. It is not a word-for-word translation of English, not even close. Well, maybe close, but it is not a word-for-word translation. It's a conceptual visual language. It's based on ideas. And we'll talk a little bit more about sentence structure when it comes to ASL a little later on. It incorporates, obviously, gestures and signs, but also mime, lip reading or speech reading, finger spelling, facial expressions. All of these are an important part of an ASL conversation, and it's a problem for 911 telecommunicators. It's a big problem. When we're on a voice call with someone, we have when we're in a face-to-face voice conversation with someone, we get a lot of nonverbal communication cues that we use to interpret what the person is saying. And for those of you who've taken APCO PST or one of the other classes, you know we go through this in the class. There's a lot of nonverbal communication that happens during a face-to-face conversation between two people who are able to speak and hear. I'm talking about facial expression. I'm talking about body language. I'm talking about voice inflection and tone of voice, word selection, and all these different things: smiling, nodding, grimacing, eyes open, eyes closed, eye contact. All these things that we talk about that we sort of use when we're having a face-to-face conversation with someone to gain more information about what they're trying to say. When we're taking a voice call, a regular voice 911 call over the phone, there is a strike against us because we don't have eye contact with the caller. We don't have face-to-face contact with the caller, but we still have quite a bit of nonverbal communication cues we can still pick up on over the phone. Again, word choice, tone of voice, inflection, background noises are a very important one. Communication versus non-communication, whether they're willing to speak to you, whether they seem tense, all these things whether they sound like they're sober or intoxicated or young or old, all these things we pick up on during a voice telephone call, which we can at least use a little bit to sort of glean information about what's going on. With TTY, we have two strikes against us. We don't have face-to-face contact, and we also don't have any of the nonverbal communication cues that we would get on, at least on a voice call. You would get something. We basically get nothing on a TTY call. We basically just get the words on the screen, and that's it. You don't have any knowledge of whether the person who's typing to you on the screen has a gun to their head. You don't have any knowledge of whether they're screaming, whether they're crying, if they're young, if they're old, if they're sober, intoxicated, if they're mentally challenged, if English is not their native language, you don't know what the conditions are at the scene. You have no information on it. You're basically just looking at words on a screen. And that makes TTY communication very challenging in some ways. There can be a lot of miscommunication, or you might not be able to get the information that you need. So TTY can be a real challenge for us when it comes to taking these calls. And when it comes to typing back and forth with a TTY caller, there's a couple of things you can do to try and make it a little easier. It's not easy, but you can try and make it a little easier. First of all, keep that sentence structure simple. One of the things you're going to learn if you do any TTY calling, whether you're doing practice calls or real calls, one of the things you're going to see right away is that TTY is a slow method of communication. TTY technology was first put out for home use, for consumer use back in the 60s. And there's been a few, updates and modifications since then, but largely it's still the same thing that was going on back in the 60s. It's very, very slow, and for those of us who work at the console and we're used to banging it out on the CAD keyboard and typing very quickly, you're going to find right away that the TTY technology isn't fast enough to transcribe what you're typing. You really got to wait for it to type out. So when we're asking questions or giving instructions to the caller, we want those sentences and questions to be just as simple as possible. We don't want any additional verbiage that we don't need. Keep it short, keep it sweet, and just get the basic information you need and move on. That also goes for clarifying questions. Sometimes you got to get more clarification from the caller, and you got to give them like follow-up questions or clarifying questions. Again, take it one at a time. Ask them, you know, do you see this? Wait for yes/no questions would be ideal. Sometimes you can't do yes/no questions. But yes/no questions are obviously, in most cases, the easiest for the caller to reply, yes, no, or whatever. So ask those clarifying questions one at a time. Give them a moment to answer. Try to simplify it so that you can get the answer as quickly as possible, and then move on with the next one. If you start typing in a whole long sentence about whether they, you know, this, that, or the other thing, you're going to find the conversation goes way, way slower. And it even under the best circumstances, TTY is pretty slow. Sometimes it's easier when you have to ask clarifying questions or when you need to get more information from the caller. Yes, no is ideal, but sometimes it's also better to go with like a kind of like a multiple choice question sort of thing. So for example, instead of asking the caller what kind of car is it, you know, the problem with asking a question to a caller on TTY, what kind of car is it, is you don't know what they're going to say. Are they going to say it's a sedan? Are they going to say it's a Honda? Are they going to say it's a red car? Are they going to say it's whatever? So if you specify exactly what you're looking for and you give the caller some quick choices, you might find that it makes the conversation go a little bit faster. So instead of saying, what kind of car is it, you might say, is it a sedan, truck, or SUV? Or is it a car, truck, or SUV? Might even be faster. That might be an easier way to just cut right to the point and get exactly the information you need and move on the conversation as quickly as possible. On that note, remember that when you are having a TTY conversation with someone, especially in the beginning of the call when the call first gets off the ground, you don't have any of those nonverbal communication cues or background sounds or any other information that you would normally glean from a 911 caller. When we take the call, we can tell within the first few seconds, is the person upset? Is the person sad? Is the person happy? Is the person angry? We can tell whether the person similarly is an adult, or most of the time we can tell whether it's an adult, a teenager, a child, male, female. Or is English their native language? Is English not their native language? You can tell all of these things by speaking to the caller on the phone, and we don't have that on TTY conversation. We got none of that. So until you've had a chance to converse with the caller, keep that vocabulary as simple as possible. Don't use complex terms and sentences because you don't know what the caller's vocabulary level is, and nothing would be worse than to drag the call out further by having to wait for the caller to say, "Oh, I didn't understand that. Could you rephrase it? That's not good." Or we're trying to make this as quick as possible. So use easy to understand vocabulary and terms, and that means leave out any slang. I know many of us work for police departments, and sometimes we lapse into cop speak and things like that. But let's try to avoid that. Let's try to keep it as simple as possible. Say car instead of a vehicle. It just makes things easier and faster for everyone involved. We don't need to be official about it when we're trying to get an emergency call out the door. Above all, we need to extend patience to TTY callers. These calls can be very slow. They can be frustrating for that reason. And it can be a challenge for the telecommunicator. We're accustomed, at least in my experience as telecommunicators, that when the call isn't going, when we're not getting the exact information that we need right then and there, or if the caller is going off on a tangent or something like that, we're accustomed to sort of, I don't want to say interrupting, but we're accustomed to controlling the call and focusing the caller on the information we need and sort of pushing the caller to give us the information that we're looking for. We don't really have that opportunity with TTY callers because it's a one-way, only one person can talk at a time and the conversation is very slow. So you really need to have patience and give TTY callers the chance to type out what they need to type out and move as quickly as possible to respond and adapt to the caller's answers or questions depending on the circumstance. When the caller is talking to you, you may notice that they use a sort of like shorthand version of English. Remember, as I said previously, that American Sign Language is not a word-for-word translation of spoken or written English. A lot of words that we have in spoken or written English aren't really used in American Sign Language. I call them filler words. There's probably a better term for them, but words like is, the, of, as, now is also something that would be potentially left out. A lot of these words are not used in sign language. So, for example, the question, where is the car, which is a very straightforward question when you're speaking or writing it. But in sign language, if they were signing that, the is and the would probably be left out. So the sentence would end, or the question would end up being where car. That would pretty much be the end of it, and that's how sign language works. It's not a word-for-word translation of written or spoken speech. So sometimes what will happen is that when a person who normally uses, now people who use sign language, obviously they go to school, they learn to read, they learn to write, they're not incapable of, and I think most TTY conversations are use standard English, as it were. But if a person who is normally using sign language is extremely rushed, if they are under stress, if they are on a 911 emergency and they have to bang out the terms as quickly as possible, it would not be uncommon for them to sort of bang out the shorthand version that's more like the translation of the sign language. In other words, they might, instead of saying where is the car, they might say where car. And that sort of shorthand or compressed language is called ASL gloss. And it's not commonly used by sign language users, but it is something they may choose to use on the TTY, or they may lapse into if they're under duress, if they're in a rush, which is something that could conceivably happen on a 911 call. So if you see someone who's typing in that way and they say where car instead of where is the car, that doesn't mean that they're that they don't know how to speak English, or that something that may be the way they type just for brevity and to get the message out as quickly as possible. So you should be anticipating that when you take the call. Okay, so you've gotten the call, you've conversed with the caller, you've gotten the information, whatever else it may be, and you're going to be dispatching units to the scene. You're going to be dispatching police, fire, EMS, or something like that. Remember, just because police, fire, and EMS are going out there doesn't mean that they're going to be able to communicate with the person at the scene. Your agency may have a procedure on certain things that need to be done when the caller or the victim is hearing or speech impaired. But either way, I think at a bare minimum, at a very bare minimum, you're going to want to notify the responders who are going to the job that the person there is hearing or speech impaired. That would be lousy if they didn't know that. They go out there for a police matter or a medical or something, and they get there, and now they have to wait for us to call out, a sign language interpreter or some other method of them communicating with the victim. That would not be good. It would really slow things down. So at a bare minimum, I would say alert the responders to let them know that the person they're going to assist or the person who called is hearing or speech impaired. Even something as simple as knocking on the door, they need to know that the person may not be able to hear or see them, or hear or speak to them when they knock at the door, or things like that. That would be an unpleasant surprise for responders. So make sure, I'd say at a bare minimum, that they're aware that an impairment exists. Speaking of the conversation itself, a lot of us, I'm pretty sure almost all of us are recording our 911 calls for legal purposes and for later review. Some of us have the ability to listen to our 911 call recordings at the desk, whether we're talking about instant retrieval at the desk or whether we're talking about long-term storage. The agency and the telecommunicator need to know where the TTY conversations are being logged and how. If you have to go back, if you send officers out to the scene and then they get you on the radio and they say, oh, could you go back and listen and see, what apartment they said it was or something? Do you have the ability to pull that up in your phone system or on your TTY system or your CAT system? Whatever your agency does to record this sort of thing, you need to be familiar with it so that you can pull it up at a moment's notice when requested, and know where to go. Otherwise, because if you just listen to the audio tape, there's a good possibility all you're going to hear is the audio tones and not be able to interpret it at all. TTY users tend to use a lot of abbreviations for obvious reasons, just like people who use texting, or whatever, a lot of abbreviations. Now, speaking of texting, the abbreviations between texting and TTY are not the same. Although, yes, we are seeing that some people who have a younger crowd who are using TTY devices, and they use abbreviations from texting, the LOL or whatever. But that being said, TTY conversations are a little slow, and only one person can talk at a time. That's a big part of TTY conversation, is that it is impossible for both people to talk at once. Only one person can talk at a time. So TTY conversations tend to have their own little structure or traditional format that it's considered to be good courtesy and just overall it makes it manageable to use a particular abbreviations and format for TTY. So there are definitely 5 abbreviations that are part of that, which you really do need to know. And we're going to go over them right now. Well, the first one is most common is GA for go ahead. GA is basically used at the end of every sentence or question, and I see some folks are raising their hands. If you're doing that, I will definitely get to it at the end. Don't worry. GA is used for go ahead. You use that at the end of every sentence or question. Remember, only one person can talk at a time. So if it's considered customary and courteous, and really just it's really just absolutely mandatory that you always end your when you're ready for the other person to start answering or typing, that you put GA for go ahead. And if you see that the other person is typing and there's a pause in the typing and it's just sort of like sitting there, that doesn't mean that it's your turn to start talking yet. When they say, I mean, unless it's an emergency maybe, but other than that, you got to wait for them to say GA for go ahead. Otherwise, they might get confused or something like that. The Q for question mark, remember, the original TTY standard, there was no punctuation. It was just A through Z and 0 through 9. Many newer TTY devices do have the ability to send punctuation, but officially speaking, there is no punctuation in TTY. So for many years, TTY users used the capital letter Q instead of a question mark. We'll look at an example of that in a minute, but basically the way you would ask a question, you say, where is the emergency? Q, GA. That would be the proper format for doing a question, and then say go ahead to the other side of the phone. Similarly, regarding backspaces, the original TTY standard didn't have the ability to do backspacing. Again, some modern TTY equipment does. But traditionally, if you wanted to, indicate an error or something like that, you would just put XXXXX, and then you would just type in the corrected information that you wanted to say. The SK is for when you end the call. When we're on a voice call with someone, we sort of get from the tone of their voice and the flow of the conversation that we're saying goodbye and we're going to hang up. We don't have that on TTY. So the first one is SK for stop keying, or that's like the initial goodbye. So that's when you put SK, that means, okay, it was nice talking to you. I'm going to say goodbye now. And then the other person will say, okay, goodbye, like over and out, or whatever you want to say, and they'll put SK, 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 SK. When you see a long string of SK like that, that means that the person who's typing is going to hang up the phone. And again, they can't hear the click like a voice caller would. So that long string of SK, SK, SK means, okay, I'm hanging up the phone, this is the click, and anything you type after this, I'm not going to see it because I'm off the line. So at the end of the conversation, we say, okay, have a nice day, SK, and then the other person says, okay, thanks, have a nice day, bye, SK, 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 and that's the end of the call. Here we see some examples of some abbreviations in progress, and this is also a little bit of a kind of a quick and dirty example of how they might use ASL gloss to sort of condense down the questions. You can also see we have the Q and the GA in there to indicate the question mark and the go ahead. And if you look on the internet, there's all kinds of information about this sort of thing. You can look up about ASL gloss and things like that. Kind of special situations regarding TTY, there's 2 of them I'm going to discuss. One of them is hearing carryover, or HCO. In an HCO conversation, the person you're conversing with has the ability to hear, they just don't have the ability to speak, or they don't have the ability to speak normally. This can make so the way that works is the caller has to type their answers to you on the TTY, but when it comes to your questions, you can just ask them normally with your voice and they hear you. This can make things a little faster. Still not great, but it can make things a little faster because only half of the conversation needs to be typed. And that way, you sort of, I guess, save like 50% of the time or whatever. So that can make things a little bit easier. The opposite scenario of that is VCO, or voice carryover. In a voice carryover situation, the caller is able to speak, but they're not able to hear. The most common scenario with this is someone who was born with standard hearing, with typical hearing, and they were able to retain that hearing at least through the age of speech development. So for at least the first 2 or 3 years of their life, when they learn to talk, excuse me, they had the ability to hear. And then at some point later in the game, whether it was when they were a child or maybe later they got injured or an illness or something as an adult, whatever it may be, they lost the ability to hear, but they still retain their ability to speak. In that situation, it's the opposite. They can speak to you normally, but if you want to talk to them or ask them questions, you have to send a TTY message. We also see this, if you have somebody who is hearing impaired, but they had special training in how to speak, even though they don't have the ability to hear. They were trained in how to do it. HCO and VCO are a fairly rare situation, as far as I can tell. Granted, I've only been in this business for, it's been what now, 18 years now. But I've never received I've received my small amount share of TTY calls, but never an HCO or a VCO call. So maybe at your center it's different, and if so, I would love to hear from you and maybe hear an example of how that would work if you have the opportunity, but I haven't received any. But be prepared for that possibility. Moving along to telephone relay services, some TTY users have started to use telephone relay service instead. Telephone relay service is something that's funded by the phone companies. Usually it's done through the state or the regional authority. A telephone relay service is kind of like many of us probably use foreign language interpretation at our 911 center. You have Language Line or one of the other ones where there's a foreign language interpreter who sort of negotiates the call for you. Telephone relay service is kind of like a foreign language interpreter for a TTY call. They're regulated by the FCC. Basically, you connect using the TTY relay service, and the operator reads off from their TTY device what the caller is typing, and then you reply back by voice to the TTY operator, and they type it into their keyboard for you, and so they sort of like, relay the messages back and forth. It's not really that fast. It sounds like it would go faster than a regular TTY call, but it's not really that fast because everybody still has to do all the typing, and then on top of that, you have to wait for the operator to read back to you in voice what the caller typed, and vice versa. So it's not super fast. If you're getting one of these calls, remember that, don't just hang up the phone. It's not like a sales call. You hear the operator coming on and saying that they have a call, and be prepared for there to be some long pauses as the operator types and reads and receives and things like that. So it makes it a little easier maybe, but not necessarily faster. Remember, just like with a language interpretation service, you're going to want to address the operator in the first person. Pretend you're talking directly to the caller. The operator is going to type exactly what you said into the machine, and they're going to read off exactly what was printed out from the machine back to you. So instead of saying, could you ask her when she did this, just say, where are you right now? Use the you, not the third party, could you ask them, and things like that. Address them in the first person. Remember, Title II of the ADA means that your center is not allowed to rely on relay services. You're not allowed to say, well, if we ever get a 911 TTY call, we'll just get the relay operator on the phone or something like that. You're not allowed to do that. You have to, look, if somebody wants to call you with the relay service, of course we'll take the call. But if they're calling you with TTY, you can't sort of slough that off onto the relay service and say, well, they'll worry about it. We'll handle it the easy way. That's not acceptable. We're going to take a quick look at how a telephone relay service works. It's a 4-minute video. Unfortunately, this particular video isn't about 911 calls. It's about a guy who is, making travel arrangements or something with his travel agent, but you will get the idea. So let's start that.
A person who is deaf or hard of hearing may benefit from using a text telephone, also known as a TTY, to type his or her conversation. The operator then relays the other person's spoken words by typing them to the TTY user.
Travel time, this is Mary. May I help you?
Hello, person's calling through the relay service. This is relay operator 3600. Have you received a relay call before?
No, I don't think so.
The person who has called you is deaf or hard of hearing. The caller will type their conversation and I'll read it to you. When you hear the words, go ahead, it's your turn to speak, and I'll type everything heard. Please speak directly to the caller and say go ahead when you're ready for a response. One moment for your call to begin. This is Emeka Bello. I need to change my flight scheduled for this Friday. My client added a meeting and I need to stay several hours later. My confirmation number is NP23116. If you can get me out on the last flight of the day, arriving before midnight, it would be helpful. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Emeka. Let me look that up for you. It looks like there is still room on the 7:30 flight that will get you back by 11:15. Will you have time to finish your meeting and get to the airport by at least 6 o'clock? Go ahead.
That's perfect. I have to take another call right now. When everything's confirmed, please call me back. Dial 711 and give them my TTY number. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, I just skipped over the last part of the video, but basically the way the caller does that is they would dial 711, and then they give the relay operator the phone number that they're looking to actually call, and then the relay operator completes the call and takes care of it. And the same thing for incoming calls. So when you get that 911 call or that 7-digit call at your center, it really seems to depend. Sometimes you can see in the video the operator gives the little like introductory spiel where they say, "Oh, this is the relay operator," you know, and they give you little instructions. It seems to vary. I'm not sure why, you know, how they determine when they give their little introductions. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I don't know if at your center, if you've gotten these relay calls, we get them sometimes. I don't know if you are getting a little introduction or not. But again, if you're getting that call, don't just say, "Oh, it's some sales thing," and hang up on them. It could be the operator introducing the call. Also in the video, you can see that you know, they're typing back, they're talking, typing back and forth. In real life, there is a substantial delay, and the video speeds it up quite a bit. They cut it out, but there's a substantial delay while, you know, once you're done talking, then the operator type. There's a delay for that. Then there's another delay while they're waiting for the response to come back from the caller or whatever. So it's a lot longer than it looks in the video. So these calls do run slowly, and you need to have patience. You should expect there to be, you know, some pauses or whatever as everyone types back and forth. Moving on to video relay services. Video relay services are sort of a little different to the telephone relay service. In a video relay service situation, instead of using a TTY to call back and forth to type back and forth, in a video relay service they use a webcam or a camera. The interpreter is, you know, looking over the video link to the caller. The caller is signing, the interpreter is signing back, and the interpreter is sort of you know, reading off to you or interpreting back to you what the caller is signing. Now, the big player in this game is a company called Sorensen Communications. They're like the, you know, the Google of video relay services. But depending on, you know, where you are, your PSAP and your 911 authority and which company they're using, you know, they may be able to access the 911 trunk network and send the call into you. Send the call into you on a 911 line with any alley. Or they may not be able to. They might be sending that emergency call to you on your 7-digit number, and you're getting it, and they're actually reporting an emergency. We're going to take a look at a 911 demonstration video from Sorensen. It's also about 4 minutes. Let's jump into that now.
Hello, 911. What's the nature of your emergency?
Hello, this is an emergency call through Sorensen Video Relay Service. I'm interpreter 3200, interpreting for a person who uses sign language to communicate. There may be some pauses. And your caller is saying, I have an emergency situation. My husband has fallen from a ladder, and he is now laying on his back. He's unable to move, and his back is hurting him pretty bad.
What address are you calling from?
My address is 64 Park Street, Lindstrom, Minnesota.
Are you with your husband right now?
Yes, well, he's just right outside the door. I can see him through the window. I can see him.
Is he conscious?
Yes, he's conscious.
And how far did he fall?
I would say maybe 6 to 7 feet.
Can you tell what part of his body's been injured?
No, you can't see anything, but he told me that his legs are hurting because, well, he can't move them, and his back he's having a lot of pain. It's pretty severe.
Is there any serious bleeding?
No, no bleeding.
Okay, I'm sending the paramedics to help you now. Stay on the line and I'll tell you exactly what to do next. Do not move him unless he's in danger. And do not splint any injuries.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so a couple of notes from that video. Number one, remember we said that sign language is not really a word-for-word translation of English language. The interpreter does have a little bit of, let's say, discretion regarding how they interpret what the caller says. That can actually work to our advantage to some extent because unlike a TTY relay operator, a telephone relay operator, which has to read exactly what's on the screen and vice versa, the VRS interpreter has eyes into the scene basically. They can actually see what's going on in the background. They might, even if the caller is not able to communicate effectively, the interpreter might, in some situations, be able to help you out a little bit with gleaning more information from the scene. There was actually an incident recently. I can't remember exactly where it is. I don't have the paperwork in front of me, but they had a kitchen fire, and the caller was trying to sign, and the interpreter was having difficulty. Long story short, the video relay interpreter realized there was smoke in the background on the camera video and notified the 911 operator, and they ended up sending the fire department. Even though we do want to, sort of interact with the interpreter in the first person, as if we're talking to the caller, just like with the telephone relay operator and everything else, they may have a little more information to give you. They might be able to have a little more latitude in what they're able to help you find out from the caller. Number two, video relay services, aside from the additional information you might be able to get from the interpreter, they tend to move faster. There are some pauses, and it certainly doesn't move quite as fast as a regular phone call. But I'm inclined to say that it moves much, much faster than a TTY conversation, where everything has to be typed out and you have to wait for the typing and responding on either side. It's not 100% fast, but it is quite a bit faster, in my experience. So if you're not familiar, and by the way, if you're doing training at your PSAP and you want to have some more training materials, Sorensen is very good about training materials for 911 centers. You can reach out to them and get information for your PSAP. They have stuff on their website and things like that. Okay, so I just want to mention right at the end here, this is a short clip from Sorensen about their new iPhone app. Look, a lot of these folks, I know in the video for the 911 technology, for the 911 calls, it shows how the person, they have like the little Xbox camera on top of their TV or whatever. I'm sure there are plenty of people who still have that. But I think it's fair to say that most of the people who are placing video relay calls using one of these interpretation services like Sorensen, they're almost certainly these days, I mean, I think the majority of them are going to be using iPhones or tablets to make this call. And if you take cellular 911 calls at your PSAP, you can understand how this adds yet another sort of like monkey wrench into the situation for taking, because as it is right now, when taking voice cellular calls over 911, it's already enough of a challenge for us to find out from the caller where they are, find out their exact location, what building, what floor, what room, and all that, to find out what the emergency is and where exactly they're located. That's hard enough with a voice call, but now if you sort of bring a video relay service interpreter into the mix, look, what can I say? It's going to make it that much more difficult. I mean, if this guy in the video here who we just saw, you know, standing on a street corner and talking to his boss or whatever it was, this isn't a 911 demo, but I mean, if this guy was standing on a street corner reporting a car crash or some other emergency and he's signing to an interpreter through the camera over his iPhone, you know, that's going to be a tough challenge to really get the information we need, to get the caller's location, to get all the other information. It's a tough one. So this is something that I think that centers who get these video relay calls on any kind of frequency, in any kind of volume, they need to be thinking about how they're going to handle these calls when the caller is a cellular caller who could be standing in the middle of nowhere or whatever and signing to an interpreter over the phone who's then relaying the information to you, and you may not have anti-alley or phase 2 or anything else like that. Could be a real challenge. So think about that if you're getting these calls with any frequency. Speaking of your agency, I want to switch gears right at the end here and talk about what your agency might be wanting to do in terms of preparing for taking TTY calls or efficiently handling TTY calls. First of all, Title III of the ADA requires that telecommunicators be trained in how to handle TTY calls at least every 6 months. Obviously, you know, more frequently would be great. I know there are some places that are doing it every quarter or every month. I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily something that's required. It could depend on your state or other local regulations. But certainly the FCC says, and Title III of the ADA say, it's got to be at least every 6 months. That training can take whatever form you want. I think the best way to train on that would be to practice, which I'll talk about in a second. Another thing that your agency should have is TTY capabilities ready to go at every position. I have seen, it's been quite some time, but I have seen a few centers where, I haven't been everywhere, but I've seen a few centers, and I've seen some where they have TTY only at one position, or they only have it at the call-taking positions. They don't have it at the dispatch positions. I think that really TTY, again, with newer computerized phone consoles, this is becoming, you know, it's more common to just have it at every position. But bottom line is, I would recommend that TTY be available at every position, and that every position be able to answer the call quickly in case they, you know, if you only have TTY keyboard at one position and you get a call and, you know, oh, we'll just transfer it over to the other position. What if that person's on the phone already, or what if they're busy, or I don't know, whatever. So that would not be good. So you want to have that at every position. Standards suggest that you place TTY test calls on a regular basis, and that you document the results of those calls. You know, if you want to call into 911 or you want to call into your admin line, and, you know, place a call, make sure it's, you know, it's being handled quickly, it's being handled efficiently, it's being handled properly. And, you know, they recommend that you document the testing so that you can have that on file for, you know, legal liability reasons and standards compliance, accreditation, things like that. That certainly sounds like a good idea to me. We discussed this a little bit previously. How is your center recording the text of TTY calls? And that's both for long-term storage and also in case, you know, you need to quickly review what the caller said in order to, you know, tell the responder, you know, they forgot the apartment number or we need to verify the information or something like that. How are you recording that and how are you accessing it both in the short term and the long term? Again, some places, if the TTY system is built into your phone software, your CPE software, then you know, you should hopefully be able to just pull it up, but you should know how to do it. You should, your telecommunicator should know where to look. Maybe you have it stored separately. If you have separate TTY equipment that's not integrated into your phone system, you have a separate keyboard for it or whatever, then obviously it might be recorded in a different place. And then some places have the phone system linked up to the CAD where it can dump the TTY conversation directly into the narrative of the CAD. That certainly has some nice advantages, so I can't really complain about that. But either way, you should know where it's stored, for how long, and how to get it when you need it. Same thing goes for your backup site. We're lucky enough at my place to have our own, independent backup site that only belongs to us, that we go to in an emergency and things like that. Does your backup site have TTY capability? Is it the same software and everything as used at your primary site? A lot of us, I think, in this industry are sort of making, MOUs with other agencies to act as the backup site. You have an agreement to go to another town or another county or something like that in order to do your, in case you fail, you just go over there. Do they have the same TTY software, the same capability? Do you know how to use it? Have you tested it? What happens if you roll your calls over there from your center? Are TTY users able to get through normally if it rolls over like that? So that's something that your agency should probably be thinking about, just in case that does happen, because we all know if it could happen, it will happen. Text to 911, which is probably a whole separate webinar, which we'll have to do at some other time. That's another show. But obviously text to 911 is becoming more popular with users as opposed to TTY because it's just easier. It's just easier and more people are familiar with it. So if you don't have text to 911 and you're taking cellular calls, maybe think about getting text to 911 up and running, not just for the convenience of people who, to get through quicker or in case they're in a compromised situation, but also for your hearing or speech impaired community who, I know that was a big thing for our hearing and speech impaired community. They were pretty vocal about wanting to get text to 911 and wanting to have that ability so that they could call more easily for help in case of an emergency. The old Baudot versus ASCII thing, Baudot and ASCII are the two kinds of audio tones styles that the TTY devices can use. I have never seen an ASCII TTY device. They're not compatible with each other. If you have an ASCII TTY device and you try to connect it to, receive that call on a Baudot system, it's not going to work. I have never seen an ASCII device. I understand they do exist, and I'm sure probably, I think it's a Europe thing. I'm not sure, but it could be I'm wrong. Baudot seems to be the one that's used 99% of the time, but if your system has the ability to switch from Baudot to ASCII, we have the latest Vesta system. It does have the ability to switch from Baudot to ASCII if you need it, but you got to know how to do it. So if you get a TTY call and the communication is garbled or the letters aren't coming out right or something wrong going on there, you got to know how to switch so that you don't have to drop the call or something like that. That would not be good. Of course, there are some laws at the federal level. There might be some at the state level also. I'm just going to discuss the federal ones here. Obviously, the ADA, Title II and III of the ADA, is really the source of 911 centers having to take TTY calls. The FCC has guidance documents. There's a link a little later on in this presentation, which it's probably the most useful FCC document that I've ever actually seen. It actually tells you exactly what to do, when to do it, and things like that. It's a good summary document. I'll have the link later in the presentation. Of course, APCO and NENA have standards which are good. They have standards about APCO has the minimum operational standards. Basically standards for the receipt and processing of TTY calls within the PSAP. There's a joint APCO-NENA standard 31051, which is the minimum training standard. How and when you should be training at a minimum, you should be training the telecommunicators to use the TTY equipment in your center. There's also the APCO PST course. If you've taken the PST course, I should say if you haven't taken the PST course, or if it's been a long time since you've taken the PST course, the PST course includes a whole module on TTY communication and how to receive those calls. There's also a number of articles, continuing ed CDE credit articles published every year by APCO. They're available. But in my opinion, the best way to keep up with the latest things on TTY and how to take calls and things like that is to practice. That's my personal opinion. This job involves performance-based training. We want the telecommunicators to actually be able to do the job. So in my opinion, that's the most important one. And can you practice with TTY in your center? Yeah, you can do it really easily. In my opinion, the easiest way to practice making and receiving TTY calls in the center is just grab yourself a smartphone, iPhone or Android, it doesn't really matter. Virtually every recent iPhone and Android phone out there, I'm going to focus on iPhone because that's what I have, but Android has compatibility as well. Every iPhone since iPhone 9, iOS 9, They all have TTY built in. You can connect a hardware TTY and use the phone as your phone line, or the easier way to do it is just turn on the software TTY, and that basically just puts TTY on your phone. You can make and receive TTY calls. All you have to do is go to the settings on your iPhone, and you just turn on that feature. If you go to the Settings app on your iPhone, and then you go to the Accessibility menu, and then you turn on the switch that says Software TTY, and then and then you're done. You just go back to the to make a regular phone call. When you make a phone call from that point forward, it'll actually ask you before it places the call what you want. Do you want to just make a voice call? Do you want to make it a TTY call? Or do you want a TTY relay call? It'll actually dial 711 for you and hook you up so that you can excuse me, so that you can place the call through the voice relay operator. So all these are great options if you have an iPhone or an Android at your center and you want to place a few calls, and that's the way. It's a great practice, and if you document it, which is a good practice, you can turn it into a continuing ed thing and do it every 6 months or however you want to play it. You can make a few test calls. You can have the operator, the telecommunicator, call into the cell phone. You can have the cell phone dial 911 or the 7-digit number and just type and test and see what it looks like, see how it feels, get a feel for the way, the little quirks of the system and things like that. In my opinion, that's the best way to go because it forces the telecommunicators to really practice, get a feel for the little quirks and idiosyncrasies, and be actually ready for when a TTY call comes in and know quickly and efficiently how to process that call and how to type back and forth and everything else they need to know. A couple of links which might be helpful. There's the link to that FCC guide for 911 centers. Man, that's the one FCC document I found that ever really was super helpful and just tells you exactly what you need to know and what you need to do for your center. Also, we have the New York Relay Service, or 711, APCO standard 1.108.1, which is for the operational standards. There's the joint APCO, there's the joint APCO-NENA training standard for TTY on the screen right there, 31051. NENA actually has a model SOP, which you can download for TTY. It's standard 037.2. You can actually download it. It tells you what things should be in your SOP and how to operate when it comes to processing those calls in your center. I hope you found this information about TDD and TTY to be helpful. My thanks to Sorensen Communications and the New York Relay Service for providing some of the media I used in this presentation. There's my contact information up there on the screen. Again, if you have questions, if you have comments, anything else like that you would like to know, or you want to give me some feedback on that, I'd be glad to speak to you about it. Let me see if we have any questions here on the screen. If you're not a PSAP, Rebecca Rodriguez-Mead, thank you for asking. If you're not a PSAP, are you still required to offer TTY services? And do you know if there's a funding source to help facilitate incorporating this technology into the center? It's a good question. I can't speak to the regulations from the ADA. You'd have to speak to your legal counsel about that. But I would say, let me say this, even if you're not a 911 center, I am fairly sure, and you can verify this with your lawyer, I am fairly sure that everybody's required to provide TTY services or equivalent services. I forget what the exact term that they use in the FCC. It says you have to provide service equivalency or service parity. I forget the exact word. But you have to provide the same level of service. If you are not a PSAP and you have another way of doing that, maybe you're using a relay service, you might be able to get away with that. I don't know. My gut feeling, though, is you have to be able to accept, certainly if you work for like a government office, I would say, even if you're not a 911 center, if you're working in the government services, I think it's probably fair to say that you're probably going to have to provide a TTY service. As for funding, that's something that should be addressed by your local municipality. As far as I know, the FCC doesn't offer funding directly for TTY services, but that's something that should be covered, because you're not a PSAP, so you're not getting 911 funding. Yeah, that is going to be a challenge. As far as I know, there's not a funding source. I would recommend that you reach out to APCO or NENA and see if they're aware of a funding mechanism for that. If not, you may wish to reach out to the people who provide your funding in general. I don't know where your funding source comes from, whether it's tax revenue or something else like that, but whoever provides your funding, The question for them, if I was in your shoes, I would look to see if there's grant funding available to make that happen. Even if it's not available at the local level, if there's a grant you can apply for to make it easier for people with hearing or speech impairments, that might help you out if it's not available locally. So I can't specifically answer your question about whether it's required. Speak to your lawyer, but check it out. I don't know 100%. If there's any other questions, I can entertain them now. Let's see what we have here. You're quite welcome, Rebecca. Any others? I think that's it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Again, if you think of a question thereafter, please don't hesitate to drop me an email or whatever else you like. Other than that, it was great to see everyone, and I hope you're well. Take care. Have a great one.